Okay, we're going to start then. Quiero agradecerle una vez más a Beatriz Sarlo por estar con nosotros, por habernos dado la conferencia ayer y estar hoy día con nosotros conversando aquí. I'm going to switch into English then. I was thanking Beatriz Sarlo for being here, for having given us that great speech yesterday, and to be willing to talk to us today. We are just going to remind you the conference yesterday had three main moments. In the first moment, Beatriz focused in a sort of foundational scene of the Argentinian ethos, in which the independence from the Spanish was mixed amid this Rioplatense romantic tradition with the will to reinvent the Spanish language through the translation from other languages, the languages from other European nations. It was a special kind of foundational scene in which, to differentiate from the other Spanishes of Latin America, but especially from the Spanish of the conquerors that had been expelled, you wanted to reinvent the language through translation. There was a second scene that Beatriz explored related to Victorio Ocampo, in which he focus on what we would call intersemiotic translation, or translation between the arts, the scene of trying to translate Le Corbusier's Architect into Argentina with all the difficulties and misunderstanding that that implied. Le Corbusier willing to basically redo the whole of the capital of Argentina, Buenos Aires, and ending by not doing anything, and Victorio Ocampo ending by this kind of pompier version of Le Corbusier through a local architect. And then Beatriz Sarlo stressed some scenes that had to do with her own limits in translation, in which the first was this command to translate Pound by your professor, Pound's Cantos, that you have probably been realizing now that Pound has a big presence in Latin America. Maybe we could talk about that at some moment, which is something that calls attention sometimes on people coming from the States. This scene about translating Pound for this communist professor that had made you this command, and the impossibility, absolute impossibility to translate the cantos. Then the scene that had to do with this complete not knowledge of the language, the original language with Dostoevsky, this impossibility to understand where you are with a different system of writing, calligraphy. And finally, the scene of Roland Barthes, where he wouldn't get out of this kind of hexagon protected language, which is French, having very little analysis of literatures outside the French tradition. And with this example of the haiku as a limited analysis, but at the same time not questioning the fact that he was reading translations, and also that he was reading written poetry and not oral poetry. I think all that unfolding of the conference yesterday crosses in many, many parts with the lines of research that we have brought forward in our Challenges of Translation Institute, lines of research that, as you know, emphasize in the first time the epistemological and linguistic problems of passage between languages. In the second place, the more ethical problems that had to do with violence and hospitality between languages and cultures, and how translations allow you to think that. The more historiographical problems that had to be how translation becomes a way of relating to the past. And finally, the more utopian problem of how translation can become a new way of grounding or setting the foundations to reconstruct subjectivities, institutions, etc. So I think I'll start from the last, because it's where you started yesterday, so I'll start from our last moment, which is this kind of foundation of the Argentinian Rioplatense imaginary through translation. And I wanted to ask you if you could unfold a bit further that first scene, that is a very interesting thing and not very well known outside the Latin American tradition, in which translation was used not to only enrich a language, as it was used, for instance, in the German Romantic tradition, all this tradition of, I know that you read the book of Antoine Bergman about l'épreuve de l'étranger, all this idea of making your language more expressive through new means. But this was not really what was all about. It was also about differentiating our Spanish, or the Spanish of Buenos Aires, and Argentina from the Spanish of Spain through a contamination from other languages. And there's something interesting that, in the sense that if languages are systems, and maybe Beatriz would think that, when you introduce new behaviors, those systems redefine themselves and create new differences. So there's a paradox, because the more that languages interact, the more differences they create. It's not that they assimilate. It's not like mixing water with tea and becoming something that is similar to both. They create new differences. So I want to ask you, what was the real outcome of that experiment? Did it remain just as an ideal, as an utopia? Did it have some impact? Did the impact went through this romantic people like Gutierrez or Alberdi, etc., or the foundation of the Spanish language took a different, or the Argentinian language took a different path from this ideal that was set during the Romantic period by these authors?
Well, that means trying to summarize Argentinian cultural history through language, which it is too hard a task to do at almost 10 o'clock in the morning. But I'll try to give at least some answers. Echeverría, which was a member of the Salon Littéraire, where these people declare the independence of Spanish language, at least in the Rio de la Plata, not the independence of Spanish language in all Latin America, but at least in the Rio de la Plata. Echeverría, he was a member of this Salon Littéraire. He wasn't present at that moment because he was in Paris at that moment, really. He spent 2 years in Paris, taking back with him everything he had to find about Romanticism. But he knew, he wrote letters and he received letters, and he knew what it was happening in Buenos Aires in 1837. I would say that his first important text, whose title is The Killer House, El Matadero in Spanish, which is his first important text, a very short story, is the first result of this program. El Matadero is something, it's written in prose, but it's something that belongs to what could be later called the tradition of the gauchesca. The tradition of the gauchesca means a tradition where some people that weren't represented before in Argentine texts, I wouldn't say Argentine literature, before there was no Argentine literature, but weren't represented before in Argentine texts, in texts written in Argentina, were for the first time represented. The text is about a killer house and the bloody methods used in a killer house in the 1830s and the 1840s. And at the end, although the text has really no end, because it is not really a short story, it's a short of cuadro de costumbres, rather than a short story, but at the same time it has many elements of a short story. At the end, a Unitarian, that means a man of the intellectual elite that is against Rosas, which was the governor at that moment, a Unitarian is killed as if he were a cow. His neck is cut through as if he were a cow. And before this, he is humiliated in many other ways, insinuating that he's also humiliated in a sexual way. That's not a very open part of the text, but you can read it, you can read that through. So that's the first text. The text, of course, wasn't published at that moment. It wasn't published in the 1830s, neither in the 1840s. It was published in the 1850s by one of Echeverria's friends, a literary critic, Juan María Gutiérrez. And it became later as the founding text of Argentine literature. The second text I would mention very briefly. You have to jump for the second text. To find the second text, you have to jump 40 years. The second text is the Martín Fierro, and it was published in 1872. And that is what we call in the south of Latin America, literatura gauchesca. It means literatura written in verse, eight syllables, verse of 8 syllables. It means popular verse. Spanish popular verse has 8 syllables. Verse of 8 syllables with a heavy rhythm and a heavy rhyme. And it is a very long text, and it is the story of a gaucho which was persecuted by the elite, by the owners of cattle owners, and by the police, and by the army, and by the Indians. Because don't you ever think that there was any romance between Indians and gauchos. They hated each other. They deeply hated each other. And that is the second text of this tradition. So when the Romantics met in 1837, they didn't have any proof of what was going to happen. Really, they were just inventing, in the most strong sense of the word, to invent. They were inventing what would happen 10 years later, 20 years later, and 30 years later in the founding, the real founding of Argentine literature.
Okay, I'm going to make you just one more question before offering the word to the rest of us. And this has to do with something that appeared only tangentially yesterday, which is how translation could become a new way of relating to the past. You have been critical in some of your work, not only of the meta-narratives of the past, but also of the more recent testimonial, subjective approach to the past. So on the horizon of your anti-realist, anti-positivist relation to history, marking some sort of paradox proper of the original. You say somewhere, I don't remember exact words, but it's something like, the past is never finished and can never be repeated. That's pretty much how an original for translation works. But you have been, as I said, critical not only of the meta-narratives that simplify certain causes, origins, and ends to articulate popular history, the history that one is taught in school with its heroes, etc. But more recently, and very interestingly, you have been a pioneer in a way in criticizing the testimonial, subjective history that had been associated to the multiplication of identities in more recent historiography. Obviously, there are certain moments, there are certain moments where that kind of subjective testimonial history is the only access to the past, which has to do sometimes with victims. But it's different to be a victim than to use victims' historiography to understand all the past. And in that sense, in that double critique, or in the horizon of the double critique, one wonders what can translation teach us about the relation of the past, about this kind of version after version of an original that is always moving, but at the same time is not repeatable, and where maybe, just as one can and you do differentiate history as cause from history as narrative or history as testimony, which you identify to a sort of indirect free speech. One can separate history as cause and narrative as history as performance, as an operation, because translation is an operation. It's not a narrative. It's not a genre. So I was wondering if you could tell us something about how do you see translation as a model to relate to the past in the horizon of your critique of meta-narratives and testimonial history?
Well, that's a question I cannot answer. It's the first time I hear this question. It's not my question, but perhaps I can just try to follow the line you have opened. I usually work as a historian. I'm not a historian. I'm a literary critic that works as a historian, that works like as a cultural historian. And what I have learned from historians is to examine very, very closely my sources. I never take my sources for true. I never take my sources for sincere. I never take my sources have given me the truth of the past. Never. That doesn't mean that I don't respect my sources, that I don't respect the people who had written them, men and women that had written them, but I never take them for true. I never take their word. Never. Or I try not to. Perhaps sometimes I do have taken their words, but I'll try not to take my words. And I try to be very alert in assigning true to the written materials that I examine, or to the photographic materials that I examine as my sources. That has to do with something that literary critics learn to do while they begin their work with literary. That is, not to believe everything that the text says, not to believe everything that the text says, and to exert a principle of misconfidence. Could we say misconfidence? De confianza? Mistrust. And to exert the principle of mistrust regarding the text. I would say that is also the principle that guides when you read or when you read a translation or when you are translating. It requires not being very sure either of your own language or of the language of the source. If you begin translating, being very sure of your own language or of the language of the source, perhaps your work wouldn't be so good as it could be. So mistrust should be applied in the first term to your relation with the language, the source language, and with the language of the translation. That's all I can say. Mistrust is my principle to read literature, to read Ezra Pound or to read Borges. Mistrust is my principle. And so it's also my principle to read and to translate. Never trust yourself. Never.
I see you don't trust me. Okay, we're going to open then the conversation. So raise your hand if you want to ask a question. Yes.
I'm sorry, but I think I will ask in Spanish since I'm thinking from the thing you were talking yesterday, and I have the ideas in Spanish, if that's okay. Retomando lo que tú dijiste al final sobre que la traducción apareció en Latinoamérica por una necesidad de apropiarse de algo que no había sido escrito para nosotros. Quisiera que hablaras un poquito más sobre esa traducción de de los planos de Le Corbusier que hicieron, pues que quiso hacer Ocampo. No entiendo muy bien si esa traducción significa como una reescritura de los planos en el contexto argentino, o que como era lo que estaba, digamos, de moda o lo que se estaba imponiendo en Europa, era imponerlo de alguna manera en Argentina. Y si cuando ella se fue a vivir a esa casa que había sido construida por alguien local de un plano extranjero, esa casa se volvió inhabitable porque, bueno, por alguna razón, porque, o sea, no tengo como muy claro cómo funciona ese problema de traducción que planteaste cuando hablaste del plano que no construyó Le Corbusier y que construyó Ocampo con otra persona.
Le Corbusier was was funding the modernist tradition in architecture at that moment. So it was absolutely inevitable to take Le Corbusier as a model. Victoria Ocampo thought, and she was right, that she had enough money to hire Le Corbusier. She didn't know that a modern architect needed much more money than the millions and millions and millions of pesos that an Argentine elitist woman could put on the table. She didn't know that. that small detail, but she had a lot of money, and she could have Le Corbusier living in Buenos Aires for several months. But there emerged the first misunderstanding. Le Corbusier thought that he was meeting somebody much more powerful than Victorio Campo. Le Corbusier was looking for an state like the Indian state to build Chandigarh. And he thought that Victorio Campo could represent this very, very rich Argentine country, and there he could build Chandigarh, which was a mistake by Le Corbusier, and of course it was a mistake by Victorio Campo, because Victorio Campo wasn't clear enough to state that she was not a state. She was not clear enough to tell Le Corbusier, well, Monsieur l'architecte, je ne suis pas l'État argentin. She didn't say that. She didn't say that. So for several months, their friendship ran through a misunderstanding. Not a very heavy misunderstanding, but a sort of, some of Victorio Campo's words were translated by Le Corbusier in a dimension that Victorio Campo could not follow. She wasn't able to take a piece of Buenos Aires land and build there whatever Le Corbusier could say. What Le Corbusier really, what he wanted to do in Buenos Aires was to take the river edge and to build towers in the river edge. That was absolutely impossible. In the first place, because the port of Buenos Aires port was there, and all the wheat and all the maize from Argentina came out from Argentina through that port. So that was impossible. But that was his fantasy. That was his utopia, Le Corbusier's utopia. He wanted towers, and there are drawings of towers along the river edge. Would be nice, something like Puerto Madero, but well done and well designed. So when Victorio Campo began to offer him these very small deals, very small deal for an architect that wants to build towers at the end of the Rio de la Plata, and is offered in change to build a house, a small house in Barrio Parque. I don't know if some of you have been ever in Barrio Parque. Barrio Parque it's not a suburb in the sense that it's not at the edge of Buenos Aires, but it doesn't look today, but it looked like a suburb. So he wanted the Rio de la Plata, and he was offered a suburb with lots of trees, with lots of birds, with very elegant ladies walking around, and with their cars, and at that time also with the horses. He was offered that. So he didn't want to build that. He was looking for Chandigarh. He was looking for India, for a really important country, where really big money could be got and used to build. So that was a misunderstanding. Not only a misunderstanding of translating a type of house into another type of house, because it was also, and in the first place, a misunderstanding over the plans of Le Corbusier and Victorio Campo. Le Corbusier hadn't the chance to meet the elite, the Brazilian elite. If he had arrived in Latin America 20 years later, in the 50s, in the late 40s, he would have met the Brazilian elite, who had lots of money and a very big idea of what a state could build in Brasilia, in the city of Brasilia. But Le Corbusier arrived 20 years before. That happens in history. That happens in cultural history. You can be a bit early or you can be a bit late. The real thing is to be at the exact moment. And Le Corbusier wasn't in the exact moment in Buenos Aires and was earlier for Brazil. So Le Corbusier could not be Burle Marx and Oscar Niemeyer for Argentina. Besides, Argentina hadn't the money of Brazil and hadn't the very big fantasy of state fantasy that Brazil had at that time. So the misunderstanding, you can add a big list of misunderstandings. What is the result of all these misunderstandings? The very small house that Victorio Campo wanted to be built following Le Corbusier plans in Barrio Parque, which you can visit. It's a very small, it's not a small house. I would live gladly in it. It's not a very small house, but it is small to the idea she has of a house. You can visit it in Barrio Parque in Buenos Aires if you are interested. It has a beautiful staircase. It opens. You get into the house, and the house opens into a beautiful staircase, flat roofs. No garden, or a very small garden around it. And through the staircase, you go to the rooms upstairs. The staircase was, you can see a picture of that staircase in any picture of the Argentine avant-gardes where Borges and Girondo are present. That picture, when you see Borges and Girondo and Victorio Campo, that is the staircase which is built under the model of following Le Corbusier's house. So she got that, but 2 years after living in that house, which was built for her under her direction, she couldn't stand it. She couldn't stand modern architecture. She liked modern architecture, but she couldn't stand to live in a house built through the model of modern architecture. So, as I told you yesterday, she went back to San Isidro, which is a very, very traditional chalet in the cross style of a Swiss chalet with a modernist chalet with an Art Deco chalet, a monstrosity, but she went there, she went back to live there.
Just to push a bit forward that question, it seems to have been a sort of aesthetic short circuit that was often found in Victorio Campo in the sense that she worshipped avant-garde art, but she didn't necessarily share in somatic way the principle it worked through. Her writing in general is quite linear, although she did worship people that were doing a different kind of non-linear aesthetics. And in the case of modernist architecture, you have precisely this kind of montage inclusion in which no longer is the effect of facade that counts, which counted in that house she ended living, in this Baroque effect in which you see the whole architecture in one side, which is an effect, and then you can go linearly. Modernist architecture is sequential, in which spaces interact, passing from one to the other. They act one with the other. So the architecture, you have to go through it, the famous principle of promenade in Le Corbusier. And it was interesting that you compared that to the Ulysses yesterday. Because again, Ulysses is the same principle. It's a principle of montage. I mean, now we're into kind of intersemiotic translation, the principle of montage, which is this big revolution instead of the linear or the facade Baroque approach. Means that you're building through direct juxtaposition, and it obviously came into first in poetry with imagism, and then into painting through cubism. And obviously the Ulysses is like analytical cubism. You have the same day look from many styles as you could do for a painting in cubism. Or in the case of architecture in Le Corbusier, these promenades in which the passage from one space to the next one creates an effect, but it's an architecture to walk through. It's not an architecture to look in one side. This same principle was then moved forward, and I'm saying this because I know Beatriz has written largely on Benjamin. It became an historiographic principle to understand the past, this idea of putting fragments together and getting this kind of shock effects. So pushing forward this question, while we were speaking yesterday, and the analogy with Ulysses was very clarifying in the sense that, well, she wanted the Ulysses to be translated, but then she didn't want to inhabit it. It's because you have this principle that seems to be very away from Victorio Campo. When one reads Victorio Campo, was seen a very classical style, not classical, but I mean a very linear way of writing. She tells a story. She doesn't incorporate this kind of fragmented principle of representation that were pretty much brought forward in all these arts. As I say, it's an intersemiotic scenes where you could go from images poetry to cubist painting to modernist architecture, to historiography in someone like Benjamin, when in all is the fragmentation and juxtaposition of discrete entities that create signification in a new way. I don't know, how do you see that in relation to Ocampo's own style and aesthetic sensibilities?
Although Sur published the first essay on James Joyce that was published in Spanish, Sur was the cultural journal that Victorio Campo led for years, for 50 years. Although Sur published the first essay on James Joyce published in Spanish, Victorio Campo never felt herself close to Joyce, never. Her writer in English literature at that moment was Virginia Woolf, not Joyce. She translated Virginia Woolf. Almost all Virginia Woolf translated in Spanish in the 30s and the 40s was translated for her publishing house. For the publishing house, she also paid with a very big fortune in the 40s and 30s. So she made possible Virginia Woolf translations, some of them very, very good. The translation of Mrs. Dalloway by Ernesto Palacio is really excellent. But Joyce didn't belong to the heart of her preferred writers. She knew that she had to publish. She knew she had to publish some short stories, and she knew she had to publish essays on Joyce and Revista Sur, but Joyce didn't belong to the heart of her preferences. He didn't belong to Borges' heart of preferences. It was not only Victorio Campo. Borges was not a fanatic of James Joyce at all. Borges preferred Chesterton and not James Joyce, so it's not only Victorio Campo, it's some style of Argentine high-class goo that was acting there, because Joyce became more and more popular when another type of writers coming from another levels of society began to write and to express themselves in Argentine literature in the 50s. So I wouldn't say that it was the problem that Victorio Campo had with Joyce. I would say that the problem that Borges had with Joyce, and the problem that Bioy Casares had with Joyce, and the problem that Silvina Ocampo had with Joyce, they didn't read that with pleasure. Maybe they read Joyce with some kind of admiration, but not with pleasure. Borges' British literature did incorporate Irish literature, but Joyce was not a center of what he thought about really regularly. Neither for Bioy Casares, as anyone that has read a short story by Bioy Casares recognizes not a trace of James Joyce there. So James Joyce came with another layer of writers, another niveau of writers, which came from below the elites, not writers that came from the elites, like Bioy Casares, Borges, Victorio Campo, and Silvino Campo, but writers that came from below. A man that would have loved to read Joyce was Roberto Art, because he knew, he read, he had heard about Joyce. I suppose about Dubliners. He knew he had heard about Joyce, and he knew that perhaps he would have been able to read Joyce. He would have learned something from him. But Roberto Art came from below. Yeah, he couldn't. No, he couldn't. He would have loved to read, but he couldn't. He couldn't read any language except, of course, Spanish. So the issue is not Ocampo Joyce. The issue is these first elite writers in Argentina, which have not a close relation with Joyce. not close links with Joyce. And you can follow which are Borges' mentions of literature written in English. You can follow that line, and you'll not find the experimental line, because perhaps the most revolutionary writer born in Argentina, Borges, was not an avant-gardist. Borges was not an avant-gardist, and Joyce was an avant-gardist. And that's a very deep difference, a very deep difference in feeling, in sensibility, in aesthetical bent. That's a very big difference. Borges changed Argentine literature, but he didn't change following the path that avant-garde followed at that time. So he had no link with avant-garde. Perhaps friendship with Oliverio Girondo, which was an avant-gardist. So it's not the issue Victoria Ocampo Joyce. The issue is elite writers born in the 1890s and the beginning of the 20th century, and the most advanced avant-garde in Europe. There's no Dada in Argentina. There is a very late surrealism in Argentina. Surrealism arrives in Argentina in the 50s. So you can see that there is a déclenchement, there is a... Steps do not follow exactly the same rhythm.
Thank you. I'll ask you in English because we are talking in English, so there's no need to go to Spanish. So you said something very interesting yesterday about the sort of genealogy of the history of translation in Argentine literature. So we have the first moment of Proyecto Criollo, basically, and the issue of translation. But then it seems to me that with modernism, there is a rupture and a distance in relation to romantics. But what actually caught my eye was that you were positing a very fundamental difference between la cultura de la mezcla versus la cultura del origen, which you said that happens in other contexts in Europe, but also in other Latin American contexts. So we know that in the culture of origin, there is a really tense and important relationship with the law, la ley. So I'm wondering, what is the relationship with the question of the law in the cultura de la mezcla, in a way that has to do with translation of law, or simply with the relation of law to law in the context of Argentina? Does that make sense?
I'm sorry to ask a question. What do you mean by law? Do you mean formal written law? Do you mean oral law? What do you mean by law?
So the question of law, from maybe even from psychoanalytical perspective, as the name of the father, right? To what law is the subject in the culture of the mestizaje submitted to? Where does it come from? Would be my question.
These provinces, I mean by these provinces, I mean also Chile, and I mean also Uruguay, fought at the beginning of the 19th century for the independence, to be independent from Spain, which you could call the law, the traditional law and the religious law. But at the same time, they fought to be independent from Spain. They fought to have a law. They didn't fight in order just to sit down and open up a great deliberation about law. They fought at the same time to have a law. Chile was early organized. You were lucky. Argentina fought for 6 or 7 decades, but fought for the law. As we know, anytime we fight for a law, you fight repressing other people that are fighting for other laws. But the main fight of the elite that were the protagonists of the independence of Argentina and Uruguay and Chile was to write another law for that country. Not a traditional law, but a new law. We are in the era of the French Revolution. We were living, these regions were living in the era of the French Revolution, and they were living exactly in the decades that the North Americans were writing their amendments. Exactly. So Argentinians want to write their amendments, their First Amendment and their Second Amendment, and carry them as law. They wanted to replace Spanish law by another type of law. They were very, very, very far away from any anarchistic perspective of Weltanschauung. This was anarchic enough. The Pampas were anarchic enough for them in order to have the wish to build another anarchy on that anarchy. So they fought for the law. The first convention to get an Argentine constitution was in 1813. That was the first convention. After that, we Argentines kill ourselves gladly for 50 years. But that was the first convention. San Martin hadn't even crossed the Andes to get to Chile and then to Peru. Hadn't even, not yet crossed the Andes in 1830. He was building the army with which he will command, the army he would command to cross the Andes. And the Argentine elite sat in Buenos Aires in order to write a constitution, inspired by the constitution the constitution written during the French Revolution and inspired by the amendments written in the United States. So that was the utopia. The utopia was the law. The utopia was not to break every law. The utopia was to get rid of the Spanish law and to have a law. Because those lands, these lands at that time, were considered far from any kind of order. They were mistaken, of course they were mistaken, there were people living in that land, millions of people living on that land, but they were conceived as far of any kind of order. So they strove for laws. They were wrong, maybe they were wrong. They should have striven for other things, maybe they should. But what they were looking for is for law. Just to replace one kind of law, which had God at the center, to replace that kind of law and to write a civil law. Following what models? The models that people had at that time. There were many models all around the world, of course, but the models that were known in the Western world were the French and the American Revolution. Those were the models known. Those were the texts. People read Jefferson. They didn't read philosophers that came from the East that weren't known anywhere. They have not Netflix. They had no TV. So they had to read Jefferson. That's what they had to read. They had to be inspired by Lafayette. That was the inspiration. That gave some profile to these southern countries. I think that Chile, Argentina, and Uruguay have a very familiar profile that gives some profile to that countries, and they had different. They lived different ways. Chile organized much more earlier than Argentina. It took Argentina 60 years to get organized, but the utopia was law. I mean, so from that point of view, we have to criticize them? Yes, we could. They say they forgot they had millions of people living in the Patagonia, which, as I told you yesterday, there was res nullius. Nobody tread there. Nobody put its foot there. It was res nullius for the Chileans, and it was res nullius for the Argentinians. Yes, they had millions of people living in Patagonia. as the Americans have millions of people living in the West, and you had to wait 50 or 60 years in order that the Americans, the white Americans, to invade the West of the United States. Yes, that happens the same in the United States. So what they strive, maybe they were wrong, and maybe our fate was defined from that moment on. What they strive for is to have law. A law that had to be different from the Spanish law, and it had to be different from the Catholic law. That they strive for that, different from the Spanish law and different from the Catholic law. But they didn't know the rest of the world that they had very near. They had no idea of that. Were they wrong? Yes. Were they guilty? Yes. But things happened like that.
I mean, just closing the focus on this triangulation that you have marked as a way of breaking with the law of the father, how you put it. One could close the focus in a similar scene that had to do with the way women reinvented the law as writers, in the sense that you have written about how women also had to break this law of the father to become writers. And the way of doing it for a while was using a foreign language that allowed them, for instance, French, through the generic conventions to express themselves, things that were completely forbidden in Spanish to express. And you see a similar triangulation in which the liberation from the Spanish Catholic male, the figure of the father of the Spanish, the liberation from that law to rebuild the law had to appeal not this time to the French Revolution or to the American independence, but to an English or a French language to be able to be covered through this alibi, which was the foreign conventions of writing, to express themselves. And there was a moment where the law was reestablished and they could break that foreign language and start writing in Spanish from a point of view and from a prose or from a poetry they have really learned and they in another language. So I think it's a similar triangulation in which the breaking with the Spanish law and with the Catholic tradition and with repression, in this case for women, meant that they had to pass through a foreign language, start writing then, and then in a moment where they were strong enough, come back to the Spanish and start writing in Spanish, but they had been trained in another language, protected by the generic conventions, because no one would forbid women writing in French at the time, but they were forbid to write them in Spanish. And I think there's I think it's in the Máquina Cultural that you speak about that.
The point is that there was no journal published in French and no journal published in English, except the journal that only the English commercial society read in Buenos Aires. So there was no danger for women to write in English or in Spanish because they wouldn't become public by writing in English or French, because they wouldn't become public by writing in English or French, because nobody would read a woman in the journal which the merchants read in Bristol or in Britain in order to buy wheat or to buy meat in Buenos Aires. Nobody would read that. So there was nothing could be made public if written in English or in French. That's one point that you mentioned, and it's very important. The other is that snobbery with language existed all over the world, and especially if you belong to the margins. If you know English and French, you'll use it. You'll use it because the language snobbery existed. Existed more, including because the Spaniards were very bad in languages. So the Spaniards did not speak good English and didn't speak good French. So that was a very strong difference from the Spaniards to practice and to legitimate that snobbery. The snobbery of the elites exists. I don't know if it exists today, but it existed in Victoria Ocampo's times. And the third point would be that what you mentioned is exactly the the trip through languages that Victoria Ocampo made. She first wrote in Italian, then she wrote in French, and then finally, she began to write in Spanish. But there is another kind of trip that is all the other way around, which is Sarmiento. Sarmiento wrote in Spanish because he knew no English in order to write in English, and he knew no French in order to write in French. Sarmiento wrote in Spanish, Facundo, which is perhaps the most important book, sociological essay in Latin America in the first part of the 19th century. He wrote Facundo in Spanish, but after that, he lose no time to make a trip to Europe, go to Paris, and try to be translated instantly. In his trip to Paris, he didn't go to Notre Dame, and he didn't go to the old churches, and he visited Guizot, because he was a very important politician, and he visited the publishing houses in order to get translated, in order to get Facundo translated. So, what is the idea? Which was his idea? The idea is to flee from Spanish, to get liberated from Spanish. You were condemned to Spanish because you spoke Spanish as being a Latin American, but you have to get liberated from it. Spanish was also a prison. So you had to get translated the other way around, not only from English into Spanish or from French into Spanish. Your most deep desire was to be translated from Spanish into English, and especially from Spanish into French. He didn't get translated, Sarmiento didn't get translated, but he describes, he's very frank, he's very sincere, and he describes weeks and weeks walking around the French publishing houses with his book under his arm, just blandishing his book and trying to get translated. Even translated a chapter in one of the great magazines or cultural journals of that time. So that's the way, it has two directions that way.
Take some questions on this.
Okay. As I was listening to you yesterday, I remembered something I read a while ago in Josefina Ludmer's book, El Cuerpo del Delito. And there she says that inside Argentina's modern culture, there are two figures, the translator and the importator. No? And she says that they established a relationship with the foreign that had two different functions inside Argentina's culture. And when she spoke about importators, she was thinking maybe about what, for example, Oscar Mazota did with Lacanian psychoanalysis. Like he read it very well, he explained it, he commented it, he taught it. You know, so it got into Argentina's culture. And she says that importators played fundamentally a progressizing function, modernizing function, whereas translators, they played fundamentally a conservative function inside Argentina's modern culture. So I want to know, what do you think about this opposition? Like translators playing a conservative function and this importator playing a progressive function?
It is very interesting. Ludmer's hypothesis is very interesting, and as everybody can have exceptions. When one thinks, if you think about Roberto Art needed translations because he wasn't able to read neither English nor French, and translations for Roberto Art not a repressive, didn't play a repressive function, but a liberated function. So I find the hypothesis very, very interesting, very clever, but you can think about the exceptions. I prefer to think as exceptions about that. Roberto Art is one of those exceptions, And the other exception is not an exception, but a special case, is the very strange relation of Borges with translations. Very strange. Because on one side, he's seen, and he was seen and considered a great communicator of texts, great communicator of English texts or German texts, as in case of Kafka, to get them into Argentine literature, not only into his own texts, but into the flow of Argentine literature. On the other side, he's not a good translator. Nobody would say that Borges is a great translator. And in some cases, even the translators he signed weren't his. The famous translation of La Metamorfosis is in his. You can find it published in Revista de Occidente 10 years earlier. So history has these nice exceptions which appeal to me. The exceptions appeal to my feelings and sensibility more than the general rules. I'm not good for the general rules, but I find that general hypothesis coming from Ludmer it's very clever, although I'm not able to elaborate on it.
Hi, I wonder if I could ask you to reflect a bit on your own practice in the magazine Punto de Vista, which you talked about a little yesterday when you were talking about translating at very high speed. I'm afraid I'm completely ignorant of the context, and all I know about it is stuff I've been able to find online. But so far as I can see, it sounds like there's a sort of translational movement of theory and literary material into an intellectual space under an military oppressive regime. And on the one hand, I suppose that could be conceived as a sort of recreation of an intellectual space. But on the other hand, obviously, that translated material is working in different ways in the new context. And I wondered if you could reflect a little bit, open up for us who don't know very much about it, how translation was working in in that context for you in those years.
Very gladly, very gladly. Punto de Vista was a cultural journal that was almost underground. I myself took it to the kioscos and got the money back from the kiosqueros. It was underground from during all the last dictatorship, 1978. Punto de Vista began in 1978. At that time, two of us had discovered two very important English theorists or writers or professors, as you like to call them, which weren't known at all in Argentina. The first was Richard Hoggart, and the second was Raymond Williams. And we considered that, speaking about translations, we considered that to translate them would be a sort of breaking the French law of Argentine theory. Williams and Hoggart were exactly what we needed to break the French law of Argentine theory. I had found Hoggart in the Jaime's Rest library. He was my professor of English literature in the Universidad de Buenos Aires, and he had given me the book, The Uses of Literacy, which I read fascinated. And I had found Williams in La Librería El Ateneo. God sent it to me. God sent me to that book. I took it from the shelf and bought it. I didn't know who was Raymond Williams. 2 years later, I was traveling to Britain, and I interviewed Hoggart and Williams, two long interviews that were published in Punto de Vista, together with a third interview to Ralph Samuel, a very distinguished historian that did history from below in those years of the late 70s. So that was what Punto de Vista was proud of, because we knew French theory. We knew much more than we needed of French theory. I had been raised in French theory. I had been raised in Roland Barthes, which up today is one of my principles, is one of the gods I revere every morning. But we knew French theory. We had learned it partly in the university, partly in private lectures, etc. But we didn't know these two of what I would call social cultural history that came to us from Britain. And Punto de Vista was very important for us because we just published those people and translated them. After that, we published and translated Bourdieu, une nouvelle sociologie de la culture, une nouvelle sociologie des intellectuels. C'est Bourdieu pour nous, c'était... Bourdieu was very, very important for us. And we published Jaus, Reception Aesthetic. So what we were building really was our own library of translations, which had the luck to coincide, we had the luck to share with other people of our same age that bought Punto de Vista, and most of them, after buying Punto de Vista and reading one or two issues of the magazine, began to be writers in Punto de Vista. Almost everybody who read Punto de Vista ended up writing in Punto de Vista. So it was just a generational task, enterprise. But translation was, in that sense, very important. And I would say that those interviews, Hogarth, Williams, that didn't understand who I was. The second time I went to his office in Cambridge, he phoned his wife and he said, come, I want you to introduce him to somebody from Latin America. Because it was really a mystery. This very young person, which I was at that time, this very young person coming from Latin America, having read his books, carrying his books in order that he signed them for me. It was really strange. He wasn't read in France. He wasn't read in Germany. He wasn't translated. It was just it's a miracle that happened in our lives, not in William's lives, which I think he forgot very, very easily, but it happened in our lives. To get in touch with that kind of social consideration of literature and literary history. And that was made through the possibility of reading other languages and of translating other languages, which we never paid a peso for them, those translations, never. I consider that as we were living under a dictatorship, I wouldn't pay the New Left Review or whichever a peso for translating their texts. Nobody asked for a peso, nobody asked for $1, nobody asked for £1 for us. So we kept on translating what we liked from books we stole them. We're pirates. But dictatorship authorizes persons to be pirates. That was our ethos in Punto de Vista. I could give many other anecdotes, but that was our ethos. And thank you for the question.
Speaking about this piracy is very interesting, how you give a new example of this mixture that it would be very difficult to find in someone different from Argentina or from this south of South America. You would have reception theory, a sociological approach to literature over the basis of structuralist French semiotics. And that kind of mixture, obviously, one reminds immediately the Borgian boutade of the idea of Latin American people mixing whatever they want. But it also reminds me what you were saying at the beginning today about your relation to the past. This idea that epistemologically you have to constantly challenge what is given to you. One way of challenging is putting in contact this completely different approaches to in this case, not the object of the past, or a kind of object of the past, which is literature, by having worked in a structuralist tradition that was very important for you in the beginning, and then overimposed reception theory and a sociological approach to literature, which is a short circuit that obviously gives something. And that's what I want to ask you. I mean, what did that short circuit give to you and to the generation working along those lines with you at the time? I mean, what was the kind of emergence that catalyzed from this kind of explosive reaction between these three very different approaches to literature?
Well, it's very difficult to answer that. We might say that Josefina Ludmer is a very good representative of that mixture of authors. It's very difficult to speak about myself. I would say that what we find in the Universidad de Buenos Aires and the Universidad Rosario now is a style of doing literary criticism, cultural history, sociological history, sociology of literature that comes from those years. Was prepared, more than emerges, it was prepared through those years. During those years of the dictatorship, I worked with historians, with Argentine historians, historians doing Argentine history, I'm sorry. I worked with historians doing Argentine history, and they worked with me. And there was a mixture also there, which we enjoyed a lot during the dictatorship. But I would say that the result of that can be found today in what is published by people 20 or 30 or 40 years younger than myself. Not myself, but the people that were our students in the university after democracy came back to Argentina and forever, since 1983 on. I came back to university in 1984 with democracy, and there you can have almost 30 years of working there.
Yeah, what one sees sometimes in the Argentinian tradition today is a sort of tension between traditions that also protects them from this kind of new globalized system of politically correctness. There's something that is kept alive, and you don't just stay in this political correctness, that it's kind of a system by now, that you keep this tension alive between different traditions that question one another, and that allows you to move forward. I mean, to be constantly questioning where you stand. And I think that is something that you see much more in Argentina than in Chile, by the way, I would say. In Chile, there is more of a rest in the more international, politically correct arena. More questions on this side, that side? Jade, yeah?
I have just a kind of point of information, since you're such a fund of information. The relationship between Sur, the journal, and what I believe, I'm not a specialist in this field, the Revista de Occidente, which was a Spanish one, that a lot of early 20th century German things were translated into Spanish and appeared in that, particularly an essay by Franz Roh on magical realism. And people say that it was through its publication there that actually Latin America then knew that it was doing magical realism or something. What is the relationship, and it's a question for information, between Sur, if there was one, and the Revista de Occidente?
Well, that I can answer. Ortega y Gasset was one of the first people that encouraged Victorio Campo to publish a cultural journal. They were friends and lovers, and in Buenos Aires, which can be told because both are dead today, so they have no moral laws to abide by. They were friends, and everybody says lovers in Buenos Aires. And Ortega y Gasset had the idea that she had enough money to publish a journal like on the style of Revista de Occidente in Buenos Aires. There was another man, also friend and lover. Victoria Campo was a very free woman, absolutely free. in that sense, absolutely contemporary. Or perhaps not today, and she's not a contemporary. Perhaps as a free woman like in the 60s. There was another man, there was an American, Waldo Frank, whom Victorio Campo had met in New York, had invited him to Buenos Aires. Waldo Frank was a really important cultural journalist and essayist at that time, today almost forgotten. And when he saw the money Victorio Campo had in Buenos Aires, and her culture, and her disposition, and her guts, and whatever, and so he said, why don't you publish a magazine? And both Ortega and Waldo told her that, gave her that advice, almost at the same time. So she needed no more. She had the advice of Ortega Gasset, which was the most distinguished Spanish intellectual at that time. And she has the advice of Waldo Frank, which was very good looking, very well dressed, and very clever, that gave her the same advice. She had texts by Ortega, and she had texts by Waldo Frank for the first issues of the magazine. And she had lots of people, I mean lots, 10, 20, 30 intellectuals that were able to write that magazine, because you can say, well, let's do a magazine. Let's publish it. I had the money, and I have whatever you need, but you need the people to write it. And there were, in that moment, beginning with Borges, there were in that moment 20 people that would be able to write. You could translate whatever you liked, because she didn't steal that, as I did in Punto de Vista. She wrote letters. She wrote letters to Nouvelle Revue Française. She wrote letters to the great cultural magazines, and she got the answers. Please translate our essay. We were very, very much honored to be read in Buenos Aires in Spanish. So she got all the permissions to translate what she wanted to translate, and she had the money to do it. But you have to be very courageous to have a magazine built in the 30s in Buenos Aires, and she was really courageous. After that, many people that worked with her say she was an authoritarian, but I always think in the 30s, a woman leading a cultural magazine has to be authoritarian. Has to be authoritarian to establish herself. If not, who would recognize her authority? Who would recognize her authority? Besides, as a footnote, she was a staunch feminist. She was a staunch feminist, Victoria, really. And she defended every issue that at that time feminists had in the world. She defended in Buenos Aires.
Other questions? It's interesting also the topography designated by that relation between Revista de Occidente, which means the review of the West, against South, which is confined to the...
With a narrow pointing down.
Yeah,
you know that the logotype of South, of the Revista Sur, is an arrow pointed down.
Exactly. So also it's interesting. I mean, I would like to know, I mean, I don't remember, but probably sometime, how was the name decided? Because it designates a topography, and this relation, Revista de Occidente, means, okay, the review of the West. And it was published trilingual for a while, so it was published in Spanish, French, English. How did the name South appear? God dropped it from heaven, because Borges liked the name, Sur. Yeah. He has the short stories, because we were the Provincias Unidas del Sur during the Colonia. Argentina was called Provincias Unidas del Río de la Plata, or Provincias Unidas del Sur. In our national anthem, we call ourselves, Argentinians call ourselves Provincias Unidas del Sur. So it got there. God dropped it on them, and it was accepted. There was no discussion no discussion at all about that, and no discussion about the name for the 30s to the 80s, for the half a century that the magazine kept on going and the publishing house kept on going. Other questions?
Hi. Yesterday, you showed us how translating on the margins or on the edges can become an opportunity, a real good opportunity to of freedom, of self-invention, of, I don't know, self-definition and encounter. And I wanted to ask, I don't have anything in mind, it's just an open question, if that position on the margins maybe can have a negative side or a dangerous side, something that could be an obstacle for encounter or for translation.
In order to understand your question, if a position, a determined position in the margins can be an obstacle to translation, well, it wasn't. It wasn't in most countries which are translators. French are not translators, and they were never in the margin. And Italy, an excellent translators, and for centuries after the Renaissance, till the national organization at the end of the 19th century, there were excellent translators. So, at least in the West, I only speak about the West, Latin America and the West, which is the only portion of the world, I'm sorry to say, I know, or I have some, or I think I have some knowledge. The margin is a very privileged place in order to translate. Not less because you can steal texts. You can steal texts. You can just rub texts from here and from there, and nobody would get an idea what you're doing. I remember the first time I went to the premises of the New Left Review, I hoped, well, let's pray God doesn't tell these people that I have stolen so many texts from them, because they had received me because I was teaching somewhere in Britain, and all my wish was that they didn't know who I was really. So the margins is a very good. Well, robbers come from the margins, except the capitalist robbers. Except capitalist robbers, the rest of the robbers come from the margins. So it's a very good position. You feel entitled to everything. If you are young, and you live in the margins, you feel entitled almost to everything. In a country like Argentina, I don't know if I would say that this is the title, that this is the case in Chile. I would say that there would be some difference, and I would like to hear them if you can tell us. But in a country like Argentina, which is sort of has a sort of lumpen morality in every social class, you feel entitled to everything. But I would like, I'm sure that's not the case in Chile.
We have obviously our own cliches of our relationships in the south here. Yeah, but we always think that Chileans work very hard to say 2 or 3 words, whereas Argentina ask what is the conference about before seating, and they expand themselves. So I think there is a difference. I think in Chile, we are more timid in our relationship, not only to the foreign, but also to actual culture in general. But I would like to push a bit forward the question that Begoña was doing, in the sense that you were saying that to be in the margins is an excellent place to steal and to translate. What seems to have been less successful, even in Argentina, and you put an example with before, and Campos is another example, Victorio Campo, is the reciprocity. I mean, the moment when you have stolen or not stolen or asked for and successfully translated and created a sort of inertia of translation that already allows you to surf the wave, if you want. And once you're surfing in this wave of translations, so you feel a little bit more empowered, you want reciprocity from the other side. And it seems that there have been many scenes, you were speaking about Lugones, I think, before, Victoria Campo as well, I mean, when he tries to be recognized in Europe, Borges is an exception, of course, because he's sort of a universal writer. But there have been many scenes where after having stolen or asked for, I mean, whichever lumpen or not lumpen way of translating, people built a certain massive corpus, or a society builds a corpus and wants to be translated back. And I think that has been a big deception in Latin America in general. It has been obviously big exceptions recently, since the 60s with the boom in literature, etc. But for a century or a century and a half, or being translated back was a big difficulty, and I think a big frustration, even in people that were very positioned and very well contacted, like Victoria Ocampo. I mean, you tell this famous anecdote also with Tagore about this kind of not being recognized from the other side. So I would like to know, I mean, isn't that the other side of this margin thing? I mean, it's good to steal, but is it good to be recognized? Or maybe to make a question more precise and more actual, what will be today the ways of non-recognition that the margins are still having, or you think that's finished, that finished in the 60s once Latin American was recognized as an active voice in literature? Because there is in this globalized world new ways of not recognizing the margins. I mean, imposing over the margins certain ideologies, sometimes very well thought and with the best intentions, but that tend not to recognize what happens in the margin. I don't know if you have any ideas on that. I mean, in this kind of the other side of the story of being in the margins, which is what happens when you want to be recognized back, and what happens. Where are we today in that? Obviously, having passed through the boom of Latin American literature, having, in the case of Argentina, the big figure of Borges, which is internationally considered. I mean, I think maybe some people don't even know that Borges is Argentinian. I mean, they just think that he's someone that is he? Yeah, exactly.
I think that Lugones never thought that he would be translated, and José Martí never thought he would be translated. So there was no wish. If you don't think that something can happen to you, the wish is very, very weak. Normally is very weak. The question you ask has a sort of temporality that begins in the 60s, where translations begin to be done in Europe. Translations of Latin American texts begin to be done in Europe and published in Europe. And because the boom of Latin American literature was born in Spain, as Poseidon also tells us in his history of the Latin American narrative boom. So the question has a temporality. I don't think that Argentine authors, Roberto Ar hadn't the fantasy of being translated. He had the fantasy of being paid, which is a different fantasy. He wanted to be paid, more paid, to get more money than what he got from the newspapers and the editorial houses where he published. But he hasn't the fantasy of being translated. So being translated is a fantasy that we carry on or is part of our dreams today. It could have 50 years, digamos, a dream that is happening since 50 years, but not more than that. Or less than 50 years, 40 years. National states are given money in order to get translated in order to get translated their own authors. Most of the translations you see from Latin Americans are translations paid by the national state from where the author was born. So there isn't a new Occidental Western canon that is developed by the force of the aesthetic principles. There are states that are paying the translations. I was in Zurich 2 months ago, and I was sitting in a table around with authors, most of them women, all of them translated. Most of them not read in Argentina. Most of them not read in Argentina. I read them because I am a literary critic and I have to write about them, but most of them not read in Argentina. How did they get to be published in German in Zurich? They got to get published because the states have a very keen interest of developing a cultural profile, because in the cultural field is played now one of the great games of international relations, which wasn't the case in the 40s, after the war, where the countries were very poor and had no money to pay translations from their own authors. Imagine a long novel by Thomas Mann, published and translated, paid by the German state. Impossible. You had to depend on the market. And that builds a market. So that aid builds a market.
Can I ask a related question on this point from
Yes.
here? You have already answered the question in the last two exchanges. But and I'll ask it with a lot of ignorance of this particular context. But my question is about this margin and its privileges and perhaps other qualities. My question is, do these translations on the margin, which have gone on for decades, if not over a century, produce a form of thought that has a singularity? And if that singularity then ever gets picked up or translated back to the center, which was part of the question that Andres also asked. And if not, how do we think of that? And how do we continue to think of margin as a space of privilege? You mentioned that France is not a translating country. Is it possible to think of translation and movements of translation against sort of the self-consciousness of translators or the interests that they invest in their practices, against the kind of politics that they see their work of translation as being? Is it possible from our vantage point to see translation as a manifestation of marginality? So rather than thinking of margin as a space of privilege, thinking of translation as a symptom of marginality. Is that possible? I'm trying to go back to the question that Begonia asked earlier. Thank you.
It would be interesting to answer your question. It would be interesting that somebody who knew deeply the mechanics of the intellectual and the aesthetic field in the United States could answer your question, because the United States translate a lot, and I think they don't place themselves in the marginality. So I prefer to think about cases and not about great global continents of countries translating and countries not translating, because, for example, I know nothing about translations in East Europe. I know nothing about how translations functioned in Hungary and Poland. Once living in Berlin, one of the fellows of the institute in which I was working was a Polish woman. And we found that Poland and Argentina were very much alike. It was Lex Walesa's years in the 90s, or after Lex Walesa's years. And we found that they were very much alike. And after that, we found that we had the cultural traits very much alike. But I know nothing about that because I don't read Polish. And so it's very. I'm not able to answer the question in a general way. I'm able to think about the United States. I'm able to think about France. I'm able to think a bit about German. and Italy and these southern countries, but I'm not able to think about a national in a national scope.
Yeah, just perhaps trying to mix the general question with the case approach. What one could just realize is that there's a big difference between authors, and there is big, is sometimes huge, sometimes big only, between authors that are commonly read by other authors and the writing people in countries like in Latin America or the south of Latin America, and writers that get to be translated, as you were pointing out. I mean, sometimes there are writers that get translated very easily, but that are not read at home. And they get translated very easily beyond the machinaria of finance that they get from their own countries, because sometimes they have an ideology or a project, a literary project. And more people have literary projects now and less literary works. I mean, they have a big project, a literary project, instead of having writing books. But more and more of these projects, like in a way, they fell very well into other projects or other systems that find them a place. And it's weird of how there's a big difference between authors that are very important sometimes in Latin America, especially in poetry, that's very obvious, and poetry that get translated because they resemble more either what they think about Latin America, or they just resemble more what is the actual mood, the global mood. Sorry, Gabriel wanted to do a question.
You mentioned the period of the 60s as the translation boom of Latin American texts in Europe and the narrative boom. And that's also very much the time I came to read Latin American novels in wonderful bilingual editions that unfortunately you don't find as easily anymore. But the one thing I remember also of the time is a real controversy around indigenismo and the indigenismo movement, and in that context, a critique of writers like Borges and Cortázar as the ones who modeled their literature in a European genealogy. I wonder how that played out in the context of these journals, how that controversy played out in Argentina itself, or perhaps in Chile.
Yes, it's a nice historical question. There was one literary critic and politician, not politician, I'm an ideologue in Argentina, which was very important for my generation and for the 60s, which was David Viñas. Maybe he's not read today, but our first historical and cultural books came from him. And he was, although 20 years older than myself, he was our friend, not our father, but our friend. And he wrote against Cortázar. He wrote against Cortázar lots of essays as a playful writer. And he was against playful literature. Playful was the word, juguetón in Spanish, juguetón, which means also superficial. Juguetón means to be like a child, like playful, like a child, but it also means superficial. He wrote against Cortázar, and he did not appreciate Borges. He didn't write against Borges, but he didn't appreciate Borges. One of his own group, Adolfo Prieto, had written a book against Borges, published in the 50s, when Prieto was very young, and a sin that he carried the rest of his life, because he published a book against Borges exactly in the moment when Borges was becoming the great Argentine author. And he was a very good literary historian, Prieto, which taught me lots of things, also of a generation of my elders. And but that he carried that book as a sin, as the original sin that he had made, not received but made, consciously made. So that was the ambience, that was the climate of the 60s in the left. In the left, because as you very well know, the 60s were really, we felt really separated between a left and a right. There were some writers in the 60s and in the left that began, my elders also, that began to read Borges. Abelardo Castillo, for instance. He published a small magazine which was called The Golden Bug. And in that magazine, Cortázar wrote he sent letters. He didn't write, he wrote but letters. He sent letters to that magazine, and they wrote about Cortázar and also about Borges. But he was really an exception, Abelardo Castillo. So we began to read Borges seriously in the 70s. And during the dictatorship. As it happened with Borges, when you begin to read him seriously, he's so generous, his literature is so generous that you become exactly a Borgesian in very few weeks. In a couple of weeks, you become a Borgesian. So people that hadn't read Borges in my own generation, we read Borges very quickly and we appreciated and began to write on Borges. I made a living of writing on Borges from that moment on. But the 60s, the intellectual field was deeply divided, and the wound had a name, and that name was not Cortázar. Cortázar, okay, you don't like Cortázar, who cares? But the name, the name of that wound was Borges.
Any other questions? Yes, Rodrigo.
Hola. I would like you to tell us a little bit more about that imposition or those changes imposed by the elite to the Spanish language. For example, here in Chile, Carlos Cabezón published a book about the logical orthography, in which he said, he wrote something about that, that there must be a relation between the sound and the letters. For example, we can, if some word is with C, we can write with a K or things like that. And for example, another Jose Medina, who made a list of translations made in Chile, in which he also kept the orthography and the differences in orthography if we compare with the orthography in Spain. Can you develop a little bit more that, please?
Well, I couldn't develop that, but what I can mention is that Sarmiento had a project. As you very well know, Sarmiento put education in the center of his political program. Education was the center of his political program, although killing gauchos was very important for him also. But education, I mean of the same gauchos that he was killing, perhaps, was a center of his program. And an orthographical reform was for him very important. He had a polemic, I think, in Chile with David... With Bello. So that was an issue in the 19th century. It wasn't an issue in Argentine school, because that's a polemic that doesn't touch literature, but touch more the structure of the cultural structure of education. It wasn't an issue in the Argentine school at the beginning of the 20th century. It wasn't an issue. So the children of the immigrants had to learn a new language altogether, and they had to learn that orthography, which is not the French orthography, but it's a rather complicated orthography. The French is more complicated, but they had to learn it at the same time, and it wasn't an issue that Sarmiento did not pass on his project of orthographical reform. And it isn't an issue today, just people do the mistakes they want, and teachers don't correct them. So we are in libertarian anarchism. No theory, libertarian anarchism.
Any other questions?
I'm afraid I faint.
Okay. Well, we're going to thank very much Beatriz Sarlo for having been with us yesterday and today. She came expressly for this from Buenos Aires, returning early tomorrow. And just thank you very much.
Yo también quisiera agradecerles, no dejar la oportunidad, sino agradecer a gente de tan diferentes proveniencias que hayan tenido un interés en alguien tan argentino como yo, que sale... alguien que es tan argentino como yo, es decir, cuyos ejemplos son tan poco universales o son mucho menos universales de lo que me gustaría que fueran, y entonces les agradezco este interés que han tenido realmente.